Hi everyone. We're taking a look at the eventual communist state or socialist state of the Soviet Union here today, and we just finished up the looking at fascism and how fascist dictators like Mussolini, like Hitler, took over in Europe following World War One, the seeds of discontent that were sown there, and so on and so forth, economic difficulties. So make sure that you complete the writing at the bottom based on yesterday's activity before moving forward. But today we're going to be moving towards the Soviet Union, which, while it's going to employ a dictatorship, is not necessarily considered. It's definitely not considered fascism. It's not always considered a totalitarian state either. Lenin takes over following the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Russian economic system is in complete shambles. The whole idea of the Bolsheviks was to get rid of the czarist regime in an effort to reform Russia and try to build Russia back up. So Lenin introduces his new economic policy, or NEP. This is kind of one of those policies you really have to know. Um, this is sort of communism, sort of capitalism. So free trade within small businesses so that people can start to make money and put money back into the economy. That's a very capitalistic idea. But then the government is going to control things like heavy industry and banking, these larger conglomerations of businesses, in an effort to control output, control how much is being sold, and again, to kind of deliver some of those protectionist policies that we've seen in play in Europe throughout, the last 300 or 400 years even. This was really brought on because we have an enormous drought that brings about famine, and so it makes it really difficult for the communist ideas um, to be used and be used effectively. And so that's why you see this kind of combination of the two of them. It was intended not to be a long-term thing, just to be really short-term, then flip it over into true communism or true communist thoughts. This is Lenin's tomb in Moscow today. You can go and see it, and there's Lenin. Yes, that's actually Lenin encased in this tomb. You can't touch him or anything like that. It's humidity controlled, it's moisture controlled, it's temperature controlled, it's light controlled, all of that stuff to try and preserve the actual body of Lenin. I can't imagine being tasked with the conservation of that body and making sure. I don't know what would happen if like a finger fell off as you were trying to clean him or whatever. But every day he's kind of dusted off um, after the public is let out. You can see the communist symbols over here on the side, but it's truly kind of one of those interesting pieces of Russian history. And I think for us, we look at Russia and look at communism and say, oh, that's the devil. But this is a point of enormous pride. This is getting rid of the czarist regime. He is their George Washington. And so I think that even though we look upon Russia as being kind of backwards in some ways, it's important to understand the culture and the history that is respected by the Russian people. At any rate, 1922, we see the establishment of the USSR. Shortly after that, Lenin is going to be shot um, uh, by a woman who's much more of a. It doesn't matter. Um, she shoots him, and he suffers a series of strokes that leaves him dying, and that kind of leaves a power vacuum. And the Politburo, the Communist Party decision makers, have kind of two main people. So you have Trotsky on the left, who is kind of the more radical, I guess, more radical left-leaning person, and then to the right you have Stalin, who has some conservative tendencies, even though he is a communist himself. Stalin eventually wins. Trotsky's plan is you need to use communism and spread communism throughout Europe. But Stalin says no, it should be a concentration on making communism work here in Russia before we move forward from there, here in the Soviet Union before we move forward. Um, Stalin eventually wins. Trotsky is exiled and is eventually murdered in Mexico. He's assassinated in Mexico years later. But Stalin creates a 5-year plan. And again, this is one of those plans you kind of have to know to catch up to the West. He looks at America and says, if we're going to be a major player in the world, we have to catch up to the Americans or else they will destroy us. So seeds of discontent between the Allies really start to be sown in by Stalin, regardless of the fact that the more Western societies are more capitalist based, whereas this is more communist based. There's a competition aspect to all of this. Oil, steel, and machinery need to be increased enormously. To create that production, Stalin forces people to make their way to some of these factories. Um, some of the workers and peasants are basically shipped out of their homes in order to move into the cities, which don't necessarily have the housing available to help these people out. And so we see the development of some slums in these larger cities like St. Petersburg. These kulaks, these farms are created, these kind of collective farms, and collectivization is, again, another one of those big words that we just have to have in our back pockets. Collectivization, the idea that they're, instead of having many thousands of these smaller farms all across the Soviet Union, they're going to be controlled by certain landowners. And shocking that landowners that are more supportive tended to be those ones who got that land. And so people are forced to work. And you see the farmers in the Ukraine up there in 1931 marching to a collective farm, but protesting along the way. This is kind of forced communism, forced socialism, where the government controls everything, and you're expected to do so for the good of the people, not necessarily for personal gain. There's no private property, no private ownership. And it's not going to work because, again, the Soviet Union, now Soviet Union, is hit by more famines in 33 and 34. And so that's going to create an imbalance of food. And so people are going to start to look, okay, maybe this system isn't quite there. This next video, I'd encourage you to watch it. It's kind of funny, tongue-in-cheek, it's sarcastic, by the Brits, by BBC. Please go ahead and watch that. Then when you're finished, you can move forward. Okay, so Stalinist USSR. The secret police, again, we see secret police being used at NKVD. There's a reading that's posted online that I'd encourage you to read. It's about the kind of what kicks off the Great Purge and the Great Terror. It's a trial about an assassination that was orchestrated not entirely, but mainly by Stalin. He has his fingerprints all over this. And the Great Purge, the Great Terror, is going to last for about 2 years. The trial is 1936, but 37, 38 is generally looked at as those years. Anyone who's anti-communist, anyone who is against Stalin, anyone who's deemed to value things other than the Communist Party, those are going to be the people who get, who get forevered. We're going to take a look at some of the graphs that show facts and figures from this time period. Stalin is, for being a communist, for being the head of the Communist Party, he ends up being anti-communist in a lot of ways. And that's why, again, when we look at the USSR, it's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's not the Union of Communists or Soviet Communist Republics, whatever it may be. It's a socialist regime. The government still has total control over industries. This isn't everybody working on these collectives together of their own volition. This is being controlled by the government. He creates an extreme sense of nationalism. Again, a lot of these dictators do this. If you're not with us, you're against us. The rest of the world is against us. Sowing those seeds of fear, giving the people someone to fear outside so that they are more willing to accept the stringent measures put upon them by the government and by these dictators. So all of these come from a paper that was written in 1990. We can take a look. This is the entire history of the Soviet Union, so 1917 to 1989. But you see down here at the bottom, the annual risk of a Soviet being murdered by his own government compared to some other things like, oh, I don't know, vehicular accidents. You're more likely to be killed by your own government during the era of the Soviet Union than you are from anything else listed here on this particular graph, including any of the wars listed there. If you look at this one, the rate of democide based on different time periods in the Soviet Union. So we have the Civil War, NEP, again, collectivization, that one's going to be driven by the droughts that occur during that time period. The Great Terror, which again is only 2 years long, but then you see compared to the other wars. During the wartime periods, again, if you're against the government in any way, even if it's anti-war in general, the odds are you're going to be found out, you're going to be killed, the secret police are going to come knocking at your door. Comparisons of being killed by the Soviet government here to other governments and other things throughout history. Here's the Nazi democide. So this is being killed by the Nazi regime. And so I think we have a tendency, we look at Hitler and say, Hitler's the worst guy in the history of the world, but we gotta throw Stalin in there too, as weird as that kind of sounds. And I don't mean to make light of it, but I think there's a lack of understanding of truly how devastating this time period was for the people of the Soviet Union. You're going to do the secret police reading that I mentioned earlier. It's posted online. So this is the arrest and trial that leads to the Great Purge. Confessions were beat out of men. Stalin absolutely plays a role in all of this. The Great Terror is going to be a purge of the Communist Party. So anyone who may have had different leanings, remember you still have some of Trotsky's followers in here. They all had to be eliminated. Peasants who rebelled or disagreed with collectivization, disagreed with being moved to these factories in the cities, and Red Army leaders, because again, these people are going to have the um, influence over the army and over those men. You got to get rid of those leaders in order to make sure that you completely control the armed forces. Dictators most often lose power thanks to military coups. So unless you have the ability to control the military, you're not going to be very successful for long. During that 2 to 3 year time period, 680,000 legal executions, but as many as 1.7 million people died during that time period. I say 680,000 legal because legal's kind of a very relative term. It's legal in terms of the justice system of the Soviet Union, meaning 680,000 people were put to death after receiving a quote unquote fair trial. But in reality, again, a lot of these confessions are going to be beat out of people. You have neighbors reporting neighbors, secret police activity done for personal gain, etc. This is a rate of about 1,000 of just these legal executions per day during this time period. 1,000 people killed per day going through these trials. Um, it's a truly kind of astounding figure when you think of it in that way. Um, so we want to consider, how does Russia and the USSR evolve from the revolutions of 1917 through 1938? So we see some political movements. We see the movement away from the true Marxist communist ideas into a socialist republic. We're going to see kind of the gaining of territory going along with that. Economics, we're kind of in this, we go through periods of the NEP to the 5 year plan where we go from kind of a hybrid economy to a much more socialist economy where it's the government controls all aspects of it. And life, again, you can't imagine the stories that come out of Soviet Russia. It's haunting, and it's something that I don't think really gets mentioned enough when we're talking about the horrors of the 20th century. That's all for today. Please let me know if you have any questions, and have a great day.